We are here with Marianne Williamson. She is a Democrat running for president. Welcome, Marianne.
Thank you.
Very nice to have you here today.
Thank you.
This is going to be a fairly casual hour, kind of what we call these get-to-know-you meetings with the candidates. Just quickly, I just want to introduce the other people here in the room, or have them introduce themselves, and then we'll come right to you. So,
I'm Reka Basu. I'm a columnist on the opinion page.
Rachel Stassenberger, the politics editor here.
Carol Hunter, executive editor.
okay. So tell us a little bit about yourself, things maybe that the average voter in Iowa might not know about you, and just a little bit about why you are running for president.
I've had a 35-year career working with principles based on human transformation, universal spiritual values, etc. From the perspective that in order to change your life, you can't just change things on the outside. You have to address issues of your morality, your principles, your values, get straight with goodness where you haven't necessarily been straight. And unless you address those internal issues, which are issues of cause, then just changing your life on the level of effect will never have a fundamental effect. Now, all that a nation is a group of individuals. So the same psychological and moral and spiritual dynamics that prevail within the life of an individual prevail within the journey of a nation. I believe that a moral and spiritual awakening is necessary in this country, and nothing short of that will fundamentally disrupt the patterns of our political dysfunction. So I'm having the same conversation I've been having for 35 years, but applying it to the larger political order.
Why is the role of president the right vehicle for that? Because, I mean, there's a lot of other ways, and like you said, you have been doing this already for 35 years. There's a lot of other ways you could bring that message. Why as a presidential candidate?
Franklin Roosevelt said that the presidency is not just an administrative function. He said that's secondary, that it is primarily a function of moral leadership. If I felt that the politics today was a context and a conduit for the higher, more inspiring, more transcendent conversation of American democracy, where we are in our historical narrative, I probably would not be doing this. But politics has abdicated its role of deep transformational experience. It has sacrificed and abdicated its role of container for the higher yearnings and aspirations of the American people. I don't think anyone, first of all, I don't think anyone should be standing on the sidelines right now. The disengagement of so many Americans from the political process is the problem. It's certainly not the answer. The political establishment has failed in many ways. And the mindset that dominates our politics today is that which got us into the ditch. I don't think it's that which is going to get us out of it.
Before we go deeper into that, because I am really interested in your thoughts, tell us a little bit more about your personal life. You mentioned on the way up here that you're not a stranger to Iowa's cold weather, that you raised a child in
Michigan,
in the upper Midwest. So tell us a little bit about that.
I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. I've lived in Texas, California, a short while when I was in my 20s in New Mexico, New York, and then raised my daughter in Michigan. And also, due to my work, I have traveled all over this country a lot over the last 35 years, and my parents were world travelers. So as a child, I traveled internationally, and I have some as an adult also. But the fact that I traveled internationally as an adult, as a child, informed me. I'm a different person, I think, than I would have been had I not traveled all over the world as a child and really gotten viscerally that people are the same everywhere.
What opportunities did you have to travel internationally as a child, and where did you go?
My parents, my father was an immigration lawyer, and my parents were world travelers. I was in Saigon in 1965 because my father didn't like the direction that our country was taking regarding the Vietnam War, and he wanted us to see firsthand, and so that we would never be propagandized into a superficial conversation about what war means. I was in countries behind the Iron Curtain when the Soviet Union still existed. I was in Southeast Asia, I was in all over the world at such a young age. And my father used to always say, the people would say to him, why are you taking your children? They're so young, they can't possibly even remember everything that they're going through. And he used to always say, it will get under their skin. And it did.
What do you remember from being in Saigon?
From Saigon?
Yeah.
When you've been in a place, so you're talking 1965, when you've been in a place where the bullet holes are all over the walls and the level of fear, you know, children, we think children don't know what's going on, but sometimes children know more what's going on because they're getting it on a pure emotional basis. The terror of war.
Yeah.
The terror of war. And also, there's another experience from those years that I've never forgotten. It was when we were in Hungary, which at that time, once again, was still behind the Iron Curtain. As we were about to leave for the airport, the young man who had been our guide on the trip, I saw my father very surreptitiously hand him his business card. And I saw my father lean over to him and say, you get yourself out of here, I'll take care of things the rest of the way. And I saw the man had tears in his eyes and look at my father. And I got in that moment what it meant to that man. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew that behind the Iron Curtain meant something, and the idea of getting out and getting to America and someone who would help him, what it meant. And that has informed my understanding of immigration. It has informed my understanding of what it means not only to live in an oppressive society, but the hope that America affords to people, or is supposed to afford to people, why it's so important that we afford that to people who are trying to escape those circumstances.
We can dive into the policy there, but I want to go back to your statement about the presidency as a function of moral leadership. And what do you think moral leadership looks like today?
I think that there are universal moral themes, and there are 4 areas, particularly in terms of our domestic and international functioning, where I feel we are so out of alignment with deep universal human values. The first has to do with our economic system. As soon as we started, basically back in the 80s, moving away from the idea that a corporation had a moral responsibility to all its stakeholders, it had a responsibility ethically to the worker, to the community, to the environment. Instead bought into this idea that the corporation's only responsibility was its fiduciary responsibility to its stockholders. It completely obliterated any sense of moral, ethical, compassion, remorse, any sense of deep human responsibility on the level of our humanity. When an individual has completely disconnected from conscience, from compassion, and from ethics, that's a sociopath. And an economic system which is similarly disconnected from any sense of compassion and ethics is a sociopathic economic system. Now, the idea that market forces and short-term profit maximization for multinational corporations should be the bottom line and the organizing principle for our society, this has replaced democracy. You can't be that and also be democracy. That is a moral dysfunction. It is a spiritual dysfunction. That moral rot has led to political corruption, which then leads to human devastation. Now, I'm talking about 4 particular issues that, to me, where you see the endemic spiritual dysfunction. The second has to do with America's children. We have millions of American children who live with chronic trauma and despair. We have millions of American children who go to school every single day in schools where there are not the adequate supplies to enable these children to learn how to read. If a child cannot learn how to read by the age of 8, that child's chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased. The chances of incarceration are drastically increased. We have millions of American children who live in what are called America's war zones. Whether it's their homes or their communities, psychologists tell us that the PTSD that is experienced by these children, and it's not even post-traumatic stress in their case, because it's triggered and re-triggered every day, is no less severe than the PTSD that is experienced by veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq. We have these children, they don't vote, so they're not a constituency. They don't work, so they have no economic leverage. So they cannot compete with the clout that is exercised by the economic power of corporations in our Congress. In addition to that, we're the only country that bases our educational funding on property taxes, which ensures that poorer children will get a poorer education. These children are trapped. This is, in my mind, it should be seen as a national emergency. It is a humanitarian crisis. Once again, this is a moral issue. We are practicing collective child neglect here. The third area has to do with race in this country. I don't think that the average American is a racist. I don't. But I do believe that the average American is undereducated, woefully undereducated about the history of race in the United States, particularly since the Civil War. General Sherman promised to every former slave 40 acres and a mule. We say that almost like it's quaint. It's not quaint at all. If you're a former slave, so you were no longer a slave, but you have to make a living, you have to be able to be integrated into the social and economic dynamic of your freedom. Those 40 acres and a mule would have allowed you to do that. In most cases, it was not given. Even when it was given, in most of those cases, the land and the mule were taken away. Americans don't realize what happened, particularly once the federal troops left in 1877. The black code laws that were passed by Southern legislatures, which basically ensured a subpar social, political, and economic life for the formerly enslaved population. We all know about the Ku Klux Klan. We know about the John Birch Society. We know that by the end of the 19th century, lynchings were in full force. By 1900, you have a fully institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. Now look at those years, 100 years between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. So the violence of slavery was replaced by another 100 years of violence. It was still a violent social order perpetrated on former slaves. With the passage of the Civil Rights Movement, I don't want to minimize the struggles and the sacrifices of any of our ancestors, black or white. This is not to say that progress has not been made, but it is to say the reconciliation is far from complete. The Civil Rights Act was important, but the Voting Rights Act has already been chipped away at by the Roberts Court. That's why all these voting suppression efforts are possible. And I think it's important for us to realize that by the 20th century, the issue of reparations was not considered, well, first of all, it wasn't even considered outrageous at the end of the Civil War, and I think if Lincoln had lived, things might have unfolded very differently. Germany has paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations since the end of World War II. And in addition to that, they have guaranteed that every generation of Germans would also be educated about the Holocaust. So it's that miseducation and undereducation that has led to a lot of this as well. Also, in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the American Civil Liberties Act, by which we gave to every surviving person who had been interned in the Japanese internment camps during World War II $22,000. The Germans cannot make the Holocaust not have happened. But I think that those reparations have gone, I know that they have gone a long way towards reconciliation between the Germans and the Jews of Germany and the rest of Europe during World War II. I believe it's, I'm sorry, I'm just want to say, I believe it's time for us to pay reparations for slavery. There is a debt there still to be paid. And once again, it's a moral issue. You have to clean up what you need to clean up.
The debt now being generations old
Yes.
Makes it more difficult for people to understand, but also makes it more difficult to understand what's fair. What do you think is fair as far as
I have
reparations?
proposed a $100 billion plan of reparations. I think we should all be reminded that it's, we're paying $718 billion this year in our military. So $100 billion, I propose that it be given over a period of 10 years, $10 billion a year, to a council of African American leaders, taken from politics, academia, and culture, to, as they see fit, support whatever educational and economic revitalization projects that they feel would best be put to use. It's like Germany can't make the Holocaust not have happened. We can't make slavery not have happened. But we can show up in our time. It's interesting. There's a lot of talk about small random acts of kindness. We need to go beyond that. We need some huge strategized acts of doing the right thing. And it's interesting about race in America because even though in some ways, obviously, success has happened, progress has been made, in other ways, we're sliding backwards right now. Mass incarceration, chipping away at the Voting Rights Act. We need to do something big, important, fundamental. This is not a time for incremental measures.
Okay. You said 4 things. You talked about
Yes.
2. I'll
The
give
other-
you a chance to talk about the other 2 here.
Thank you. The other has to do with our national security. Most of our resources are applied towards preparedness for war. You know, our economic system has nothing to do with planning for long-term economic good 25 or 50 years from now. If it did, we would be supporting our children. If you want to take care of your economy 10 years from now, take care of your children today. Rather, our economic system has to do with leeching from the system. The same is true when it comes to war and peace. We don't have a policy for providing peace in 25 years or 50 years. We have a policy for preparing for war. Now, under all of these things, there's the same toxicity, and that has to do with the dominance of short-term profit maximization for multinational corporations rather than advocacy for our values, our people, and our planet. So when it comes to our, our policies of national security, while I have great respect for the U.S. military, this military should be partnered far more vigorously and proactively with a serious effort to wage peace. You wage peace by expanding educational opportunities for children. You wage peace by expanding economic opportunities for women. And you wage peace by ameliorating, to whatever extent you can, unnecessary human suffering. We should see large groups of desperate people as a national security risk. Desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people are more vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces, whether they're a gang in the corner of the city in the United States or a terrorist group outside. Right now, when you look at the resources given to our State Department compared to the resources given to our military, we spend so much less on issues of waging peace, even though the efficacy of real peace-building measures is absolutely proven. And we should have that same kind of waging peace, conflict resolution, restorative justice, dealing with the trauma of people, particularly when they're young. We should do far more on a domestic basis for such a thing as well as internationally. That's why I would support a U.S. Department of Peace.
Would you transfer a lot of the resources that are currently going into, for example, weapon systems, et cetera? I mean, is that people have different ideas about how much money we're spending on the military, and whether that's offensive spending or defensive spending?
Well, some of it might be, I'm sure, arguably, some of our military spending could be legitimized to any intelligent person. But let me give you an example of one where I fail to understand, and I think any average American would fail to understand if given the facts. Our Air Force has ordered 100 B-21 Raiders. The B-21 Raider costs $550 million for every airplane, and every one of them is equipped to carry not only conventional, but also thermonuclear weapons. Can you please tell me why we need 100 planes that carry thermonuclear weapons? You drop 10 of those, it's over. So no, you cannot tell me from any rational explanation of how we need to be prepared for war, or how we are seeking to wage peace, why we need 100 airplanes at $550 million each that carry both conventional and nuclear weapons. This has nothing to do with peace on Earth. And if I was president, that would be the value that I would place on an analysis of our military spending.
I guess, given what you just outlined, your kind of 4 building blocks.
She only got through 3.
Well,
but
she did.
No, I did.
Four.
No, there were 4.
Oh, sorry. You're right. Sorry about that.
Talk through, and you talked about kind of desperation of people and
Yeah.
trying to provide kind of more aid and sustenance instead of thinking of terms of military.
Yes.
So how does that inform your thoughts about immigration and what's happening on our southern border right now?
what America needs is a return to our principles, that all men are created equal, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that governments are instituted among men to secure those rights. And then, of course, in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said that we are to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. These principles cannot just be inscribed on a marble wall. They can't just be written on a piece of parchment behind glass in Washington at a museum somewhere. They have to be inscribed on our hearts. And when they are, we become ablaze with a desire for justice. We are a nation of immigrants. Unless you're descended from slaves, or unless you're descended from Native Americans who were here for thousands of years before the European settlers got here, then your ancestors too came here, just as that young man I was mentioning in Hungary came here in the hopes of a better life. That is a moral cornerstone of American democracy. And this is exactly what I mean, and an example out of far too many of our completely swerving, giving short shrift to our moral principles. And therefore, what is happening at the southern border, its racist aspect, its cruel aspect. Who are we as people that you would separate parents from their children the way we have? This is counter not only to every democratic value, but to every universal moral and spiritual value. I'm sorry, I don't care how much you do on the outside to address your problems. When you are that off-center with ethical and moral values, you're going down. You're going down as an individual, and unfortunately, you're going to go down as a nation if you play. You cannot, the term "God shall not be mocked." Be mocked means he isn't.
It's interesting to hear you come at this as from a moral and spiritual perspective, because there are a lot of Democrats who say, keep your morality and your spirituality to yourself. Don't try to impose them on me through your public policy. How do you answer that concern?
Traditionally, in the American political spectrum, the right has been more interested and focused on issues of private morality. But traditionally, the left has been focused on issues of public morality. This is new. This over-secularized, over-corporatized conversation on the left, that's not what I grew up with. I grew up when Bobby Kennedy was talking about the soul of America. I grew up at a time when Martin Luther King was talking about politics in the context of our higher moral and philosophical aspirations. Economic injustice is a moral issue. War and peace is a moral issue. Unfair taxation is a moral issue. Mass incarceration is a moral issue. Neglecting systemically millions of American children is a moral issue. And I believe that the Democratic Party has lost a lot of people over the years because it has failed to discuss these things. Now, the separation of church and state is a very different thing. Separation of church and state is one of the most enlightened principles of our Constitution. It both protects our government from interference by religious doctrine or dogma, which is very important. We value that. We're a religiously pluralistic society. As Jefferson said, whether a man believes in 20 gods or no gods, neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. But also the separation of state it exists to protect the religious communities from interference by government. So the founders were not seeking to suppress the religious or spiritual conversation. They were seeking to protect it. So what I talk about is not religious dogma, not religious doctrine. I talk about moral values, spiritual values. Somebody could be, I don't care if people come at these things from a religious perspective, a non-denominational spiritual perspective, recovery, psychotherapy. That's where this country lives. This is a religious country. If you put together all the people who are involved in personal transformation, psychotherapy, recovery, religion, I don't know where this overly secularized democratic conversation gets off saying that somehow we're going to get the people by keeping our conversation to that which has nothing to do with where people really live.
That's really interesting. The other thing I'm wondering about is we've got Donald Trump in the White House who came with no experience in government. And I'm wondering what you say to Democrats who say, I'm not sure we want to take another risk on somebody who comes from outside the government, who we like their their personality maybe, but you know, do they know enough to get their agenda accomplished?
You know, anybody who thinks that somebody has served 2 terms as a congressman knows about what we should do now is naive about what congressmen do. So I think that the idea that the fact that you have served in Congress means, you know, I kind of liken it sometimes, I liken politicians to really good car mechanics. You need a good car mechanic, but that doesn't mean that that person knows how to drive you to Milwaukee. We need more than a manager. We need a visionary as president these days. We need to do more than water the leaves. We need to do more than someone who just knows the mechanics of politics. A lot of people do, and you need the best mechanics working for you if you're president. But we need to water the roots of our democracy, and that has to do with what's going on inside the average citizen. And I have a 35-year career at inspiring people to seek to be their best. And what I wish to do with this campaign, and what I would do if I were president, is to seek to inspire a much greater level of civic engagement and political involvement on the part of the American people. There's an old paradigm of leadership, which is, I'll do it. You know, the politicians who say, send me to Washington and I'll do it. That's so over. That's politics as spectator sport. That's not how democracy is supposed to work. They work for us. The idea of new paradigm leadership is that the leader holds the space for the brilliance of others. It is the brilliance of the American. It is the wisdom of the American. It is the inherent God-given potential of the American to be creative, to do dignified, productive work. That's where our power comes from, not Washington. And I believe that I have a 35-year career which gives me some skill and hopefully some expertise at speaking to that and arousing that within people.
So obviously, yeah, go ahead. Obviously your campaign is coming at the idea of the president in a different way than we have seen of late.
Of late.
Of late.
Not historically.
Yes. So tell me what that means for the campaign that you will wage over the next year and a half. How is that different from, you know, the other folks who will come into this room and talk to us?
I believe, based on the extensive traveling I've done around this country, that Americans have an instinctive understanding that America matters. And what we have in the White House, unfortunately, is someone who has harnessed some of the worst aspects of the American psyche for political purposes. We need to harness love and our dignity and our decency and our compassion for political purposes. My father used to say to me, speak to the smartest person on the jury. And I feel sometimes that the political system speaks to our lowest. And if it doesn't even speak, even when it doesn't speak to our lowest, speaks to our most superficial, speaks to our most shallow, speaks to our, you know, people say, how are you going to dumb this down and put it on a bumper sticker? I don't want to dumb down anything. I want people to join with me in thinking deep. We have serious problems in this country, and we need to be serious thinkers. So I feel that people hear you on the level you speak from. And so what I'm doing is, to the best of my ability, articulating truth as I understand it within the context of the larger historical American narrative, which is a very inspiring story. We are a country that was born of a profound dichotomy. It is a tragic dichotomy. It's baked into the cake. On one hand, we were based on the most enlightened principles that have ever informed the founding of any country. At the same time, 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. So from the very beginning, that tension has existed. From the very beginning, we have been the highest principles on which we purport and aspire to stand, and sometimes we have been the most egregious perpetrators against those principles. But if you look at the historical narrative, ours is a grand tale. You have slavery, but then we had abolition. Suppression of women, but then we had 2 major waves of feminism and the suffragette movement. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation, and then we had the civil rights movement. You know, you can't pick out a novel. You can't just open it in the middle and know where you are. You don't know what the plot is. You don't know what the characters are. This is a grand story, and every generation writes its own chapter. So I find that people, sometimes I feel like people don't remember what they learned. And by the way, 11 states in this country do not even require half a year of civics and American history, which is so dangerous. If you don't learn what the Bill of Rights is as a child, how do you know as an adult to be horrified when it's under assault? So I find that audiences that I speak to, either they go, yeah, you're right, we have the dots, but we're not connecting the dots anymore. That should be the job of the political leader, to help a generation connect the dots. So we see, what is it we owe? How do we live in honor to our ancestors and in devotion to our descendants? Where are we in the storyline? And what are we going to be in our generation? Are we going to choose what Franklin Roosevelt called the economic royalists, or are we going to choose real democracy and democratic principles? But if people don't know that that's what's going on, we're sort of like, our brains are scrambled. That's what political propaganda has done.
So speaking of what people don't know, I think a lot of people in this country don't know a whole lot about the kind of spiritual work that you've been involved with, and they think of, tarot cards and crystal balls and things like that. Can you, at a granular level, educate the public about some of this personal transformation, growth, miracles work that you've been involved with?
Yeah, it's difficult. There's a phrase, contempt prior to investigation. And if people haven't actually read your books, they might think that. If they haven't actually heard your lectures, they might think that. If they haven't actually heard you speak, they might think that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to counter. Many years ago, 35 years ago, I started speaking and writing about a set of books called A Course in Miracles. A Course in Miracles is not a religion, no dogma, no doctrine. It's a book about forgiveness and how to forgive. It is based on universal spiritual themes. It doesn't have any monopoly on truth. It doesn't claim anything like that. It is a self-study program of spiritual psychotherapy. People from many religions read the Course in Miracles. People from no religions read the Course in Miracles. The underground in America today that represents a search for wisdom isn't tied necessarily to religion. Some people are coming out of recovery, coming out of psychotherapy, but it's an underground river of hope in this country. And it has been embraced by millions and millions of people. The issue, however, that I feel needs to be addressed is that for the most part, these issues, while this is a meaningful and a vital conversation in this country, it is usually applied mainly to issues of personal transformation. And that is why this campaign, I believe, matters, because it's the same principles. We should not just be asking, first of all, we should be asking, should I be a good person? But we should not just be asking, should we be a good person? We should be asking, are we a good society? That's what Lyndon Johnson talked about. I mean, when you look at him domestically, he went there. Internationally, it's a whole different story, Vietnam War, et cetera. War on poverty. You can't even imagine a politician even going there today. But these are the kinds of questions we should be asking. Are we a good society? Are we an ethical society? And that's why everything I've talked about, whether it has to do with a sociopathic economic system, collective child neglect of these traumatized children, addressing the character defect of racism and a debt still to be paid, and building peace proactively, are all essentially issues that speak to our moral core.
People who hold themselves out to be moral leaders often risk heightened scrutiny about your personal, how you conduct yourself on a personal level. Our politics often runs on allegations of hypocrisy, et cetera, personal destruction. Having been through 35 years of this, are you prepared for that? And how do you feel like you are going to hold up to that kind of scrutiny?
I have never presented myself as anything other than a human being, fallible like anyone else. I feel that I know within my personal life I've done my best to atone for my mistakes, to seek to be better where I need to be better. And I don't think that, I know that I've never presented myself, either in my writing or in my speaking, as anything different. I'm seeking to bring those same values to the public domain that I've sought to practice within myself. And I think that's kind of the point. I don't see America as always having done the right thing, any more than I see myself as always having done the right thing. But I think that America needs to do what I try to do and what everyone I know tries to do when I haven't. And that is to atone in my heart, make amends where appropriate, and seek to be better going forward.
You've spoken about kind of the excesses of capitalism. You've also referenced the Iron Curtain. I mean, we've certainly seen state-run economies that have their own evils. Is there some place, and you mentioned your world travel, that you think around the world that's getting it right as far as a more just economic system?
Well, first of all, I'm not an anti-capitalist. I'm talking about capitalism having swerved from its ethical center. And that is not inherently an anti-capitalist conversation at all. I think if capitalism does not return to its ethical center, it is going to create its own repudiation. That's why you have a younger generation these days. Some of these younger people talk about capitalism like it's Satan and socialism like it's the Messiah. That's not where I'm coming from here. Although I think it's important to realize, what do you think the fire department is, if not basically a socialist institution? What do you think the police department is? We have a very superficial, naive conversation about these things. I think it's important to note that many of our very powerful capitalist leaders recognize this ethical break and are seeking to address it. John Mackey from Whole Foods and his movement of conscious capitalism and so forth, Eileen Fisher and others, B Corps. I mean, this conversation is happening, and I think that many of the most powerful capitalists in America know they better have this conversation, or there's going to be some storming of the Bastille. It's very similar to when FDR said, I'm not destroying capitalism, I'm saving capitalism.
So you were a big supporter of Bernie Sanders early on.
Yes.
He may get into this race. Talk about the difference between you and him.
First of all, I'm not running against anyone. I'm running with everyone, all 1,736 people who apparently will be running. I think it's healthy for our democracy that so many people are going to be running. I think it's healthy for the Democratic Party. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. Anybody who has a good idea, put it on the table, please. That's where we should be as Americans right now. I agree with most everything that I've heard Bernie Sanders say, and Elizabeth Warren, by the way. So I'm not repudiating anything they're saying. However, I do believe I'm introducing a more expanded conversation. Just like with medicine, we have embraced an integrative, holistic model of healing. You can't just not address the cultivation of health and just wait till you get sick and then seek a medicine, external remedy that will eradicate or suppress symptoms. We have come to recognize that health is not the absence of sickness. Sickness is the absence of health. So the idea of proactively cultivating health as part of your model for human health and healing is what I wish to bring into politics. I want to talk more about proactively cultivating the real moral force of democracy, which has to do with the activation of the American character and the American energy. And when it comes to the externalized allopathic solutions, I'm there with Bernie, I'm there with Elizabeth. But I feel I'm speaking to some deeper layers of what it takes to prevent these situations from happening to begin with, and also ameliorating them once they have occurred. If all you do is change policy, those policies can be changed again 2 years later, 4 years later. That's why people who think all we have to do is defeat Trump are very naive. Because the forces that are the real opponents of democracy, they have so many lined up behind him. If all you do is defeat Trump, they'll be back in 22, they'll be back in 24. We need to initiate a more inspirational and aspirational politics that stems from a deeper place within the American heart, the American mind, and the American gut. That's what I have been doing for 35 years. If you're going to have a moral and spiritual awakening, you might want to get a moral and spiritual awakener to lead that process.
Do you want to be president?
I think it would be a very good idea.
I mean, because we've talked, I'm the politics editor, so I think very politically, not running against anyone. And part of what it seems like you're saying is you want people to hear your ideas from the highest level. That's slightly different from, and attend to them, be more moral and all of those things. That's different from all the decisions that a president needs to make and all the appointments and the way other people run for president.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I'm not doing this to get my voice out there. My voice is out there. And as a woman and as a feminist, it's an important issue also. Women are pretty much trained to think, well, maybe we can have an effect. Maybe we can whisper in the ear of someone who has power. No, I'm asking for the seat at the table. Thank you. That's number one. Number two, the decisions that a president makes are an expression of his or her values. The decisions that a president makes are an expression of the consciousness of the president. We have a president today, as we all know. I mean, we don't have a covert corporate takeover of the American government. We have an overt takeover, corporate takeover of the U.S. government. The first Secretary of State in this administration was the ex-CEO of Exxon, not a diplomat, not a great humanitarian, the CEO of Exxon. The heads of our EPA, ex-lobbyists and executives from the oil industry, from the chemical industry. Even today, the man who is now leading the Defense Department after the absence of Mattis was a 30-year executive at Boeing. These are decisions that the president makes. So I believe these moral values are very much relevant. Moral values are practical, or they mean nothing. Moral and universal values and democratic values either prevail within your decision making on a practical level or they do not. That's my point about the political establishment. We say these words and then you see decisions that the politicians make and you think, wait, what about the all men are created equal part? What about all men have inalienable rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and governments are instituted to secure those rights? What about that stuff? What about the government of the people, by the people, for the people? And that's exactly what the president should be. The president should be the primary personification and embodiment of someone who sees decision-making should be aligned with your values. Not just with your campaign donors, not just with your political power plays, but with your values. The president should be the primary holder of the democratic and universal human values that truly make this country great.
Do you have someone who you know or know of that you think would make like the ideal Secretary of State?
Yes, I do, but I'm afraid to say his name because I'm afraid that he might say, I don't want that woman to be saying my name. Yes, I do, actually.
Maybe
but
just
I don't
some
know if he
attributes of that person?
He is a famous, he is a well-known deep humanitarian who writes often, pretty much every day or often, about international affairs from the deepest level of moral rectitude.
Okay.
You might have guessed who he is.
Several names have popped into my
Uh-huh.
head, but
Well, there's a lot of issues. I guess I want to dig in a little bit more into the economics.
Yes.
Because you mentioned that you're aligned at least with what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have said, maybe bringing something of your own to this conversation. But, I mean, what do you see, other than the sort of divorce from morality, from corporations, what do you see as the systemic problem that you could actually fix that would try to start to reverse that?
Short-term profit maximization for multinational conglomerates has taken precedence over our democratic values, and this has infected our economics as much as it has infected every other aspect of our civilization. Louis Brandeis, the late Supreme Court Justice, said, you can have great amounts of wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. I read a book called The Gardens of Democracy that used a really good image. It said that it's like if you took all the blood in the body and took the vast majority of it and put it only in your left arm. And that is what has happened. So this idea of taking market forces and saying that whatever serves market forces without any sense of of ethical consideration, to me, this is an example of an amoral that has led to an immoral economics. Now, there are ways to address this. First of all, as I was saying before, if we were really planning, and I do believe that our leadership, including our president, should be thinking, how are we going to have a healthy economy 25 years from now? How are we going to have peace on earth 25 years from now? How are we going to have a healthy economy 50 years from now? If you want to have a healthy economy 50 or 25 years from now, you don't leech all the money from your system and give it to the top 0.001%. There is nothing there that has to do with economic planning. If you want to have a healthy economy 20 years from now, help your 10-year-olds today. We should have a massive realignment of investment in the direction of children, particularly children under 8. Psychologists and neurologists now tell us that it all happens before the age of 8 in terms of cognitive functioning and also the ability of children to retain information. So yes, I think we should be planning a healthy economy. The way you plan a healthy economy, number one, we should have the American child should have world-class everything, and it goes beyond education. Should have world-class food, should have world-class culture, should have world-class everything that prepares them for a vital life. Unleash the spirit of the American people. That's where our economic vitality comes from. People want to be productive. You want to see real entrepreneurial spirit? Go to any kindergarten in this country. That's where you're going to see, watch a child like in a Montessori type classroom. You want to see entrepreneurialism and creativity and productivity, that's where it is. So to me, it's not that economics doesn't matter. It's that our economics now is an outmoded relic of the 20th century that has nothing to do with preparing for economic sustainable vitality in the future. So number one, take better care of your children. Number two, unleash the spirit of the American people. That's why. Give these kids a chance, not only to get an education, free education, but how many of these young people, this $1.5 trillion of college loan debt, all these kids want to do is get in the capitalist system, and we're keeping them out. How many of these young people, I can't even imagine being in my early 20s having a $28,000 to $30,000 or more debt. How do you live with that? We just so many people live in economic despair. These kids wish they had $2,500 in discretionary spending so they could have their own startup, get their own website going. They want to enter the game. Let them in. Provide greater opportunities for people to live from their best place. Millions of American people live in chronic tension and anxiety. What am I going to do if I get sick? What am I going to do if one of my kids gets sick? I have to stay in this job even though I hate it for the benefits. How am I going to send my kids to college? How am I going to pay my college loans? Could any of us at this table do our best? Could any of us at this table even be fully present for the work we're doing here today if we were living with this constant tension? And yet millions of Americans are. This is so much more than about jobs. This is about opportunity.
Can you talk a bit about trade, global trade, and what would be your guiding principles for constructing a trade policy?
Well, there is such a thing as healthy competition. And, even take something like China, some of the rather egregious transgressions having to do with intellectual property, et cetera, I don't have a problem with making sure that the American worker is cared for. But I think that what has happened most recently with these tariffs, et cetera, has been to the detriment of the American worker, including here, obviously, in Iowa. I think that we need to conceptualize and visualize and imagine a world in which there is right commerce. There is righteous commerce, both internationally as well as domestically.
NAFTA, WTO?
No, come on. NAFTA, obviously, what this has done to actually aid these huge multinational conglomerates at the expense of the American worker is one of the most egregious transgressions of the last few decades. And the American people know this. That's why there was such a cry of a populist despair in the 2016 election. That with that chronic economic anxiety of so many millions of people that they knew was not being addressed by their government, and they're right about that. The desire for change was itself legitimate. There was going to be a cry of economic despair coming up from the bottom of things. In my opinion, it was either going to go in the direction of an authoritarian populism or a progressive populism. I don't think it's that Hillary Clinton didn't have policies that would have addressed a lot of this, but she didn't acknowledge what was really happening. People want to feel heard, and people want to feel that their pain is acknowledged. Unfortunately, what we got was the authoritarian populist, someone who is not the change agent that even many of those people would have hoped for. But the desire for change was not invalid.
Discussion about healthcare has driven a lot of the political discussion here in Iowa and around the country for at least the last, 2 decades, if not longer. There's a lot of discussion about who should pay for healthcare. Who should pay for healthcare. But as you bring this this sort of moral vision to the process, where do you want the discussion to go beyond just who pays for health care?
Well, even in terms of who pays, whether it's for an individual or a nation, how you spend your money is an expression of your moral values. Interesting, because nobody ever asks how you're going to pay for it when they want to pass a $2 trillion tax cut where 83 cents of every dollar goes to the very richest among us. If they want to have a $2 trillion war that turns out to be the biggest blunder in American history, we weren't supposed to be able to ask how you pay for it. Any dollar you give to education, any dollar you spend on education or anything else, including health care, that helps people thrive, aids your economy. When you look at how many people go bankrupt because of healthcare costs, when you look at how much tension and anxiety that caps our creativity and productivity because people don't have universal health care. We have been trained in this country. People have been trained to ask for too little. It is outrageous.
We're at 1:15, and I know you have someplace else to go. I just wanted to give, first of all, if there's any last burning question here, or to give you a chance to sum up.
Will we see you a lot in Iowa?
You'll see me a lot in Iowa.
In good weather and bad.
Yeah. I raised my daughter in Michigan, so it's not that different.
I don't know. I came here from Minnesota. I did not like yesterday.
Oh my goodness! Well, Minnesota, I'm surprised to hear you say that.
I am glad to be 10 degrees
You really
warmer.
depressed me just now. Because I thought, it's like Michigan.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, go ahead and wrap it up for us, and if you would, maybe just talk a little bit about what you see as your path.
This idea of, I don't believe that social change occurs along a horizontal axis. I think it occurs along a vertical axis. So politics as it is now practiced tends to be dumbing it down, keeping it superficial, trying to twist yourself so that your message, this person will be okay with what you just said, and that group will be okay with what you just said, and that group will be okay with what you just said, and it makes everything so shallow. I just want to go vertical. I want to speak the truth as articulately as I can, as clearly as I can, and with as much clarity as I can, the truth as I understand it. And that to me has force. It is convicted. Conviction is a force multiplier. Many more people in this country love than hate. Now that's in the world as well. The problem is that hate in this country has harnessed for political purposes, and those who hate and those who fear, those who are bigots, those who are racists, homophobes, anti-Semites, etc., are very convicted. The problem is not that there are more of them than there are people coming from the most decent, dignified place. It's that those of us who come from those values that are the true greatness of the American character, as I said before, too often apply these principles to our individual lives, but not to our public sphere. We need to become as convicted behind love, convicted behind compassion, convicted behind a more enlightened perspective and reverent and devoted perspective on life, human relationships, stewardship of the earth, as some people are now convicted behind fear and hate. The abolitionists would not have thought their cause was reasonable. The suffragettes would not have thought their cause was reasonable. The civil rights movement, there was no rational basis for thinking they could be successful. That's not how society changes. Society doesn't necessarily change because the majority wakes up one day and says, oh, let's do that. It's because there's enough conviction harnessed that becomes a force multiplier. That's not strategy, that's just the power of truth.
Okay. Well, Marianne Williamson, thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
here. This is the second in a series of discussions and conversations with presidential candidates. We have also met with Democrat John Delaney. You can find his interview on DesMoinesRegister.com and all of the great and up-to-the-minute coverage of the Iowa caucuses and Iowa politics on DesMoinesRegister.com. Thank you.